once again. We'll be talking about ground preparation techniques here in this lecture. And we'll also be talking about popular fertility management techniques. And as is with most of our lectures and discussions here, this is an introduction. There are, of course, many more options for ground prep and fertility management than what will be discussed here right now. These here are more of the common ones that you'll see practiced in organic agriculture. And then we'll also kind of visit it through a regenerative farming lens as well. So some of this content is influenced by the Canadian Organic Grower book that we were talking about for crop planting. They have a section in there, I think it's chapter 8 perhaps, talking about tillage and cultivation and fertility management. And what is commonly used in certified organic farming. However, it kind of is geared towards the content of that book anyway, is geared towards more kind of conventional organic farming. And I'm going to try to bring this back to a bit of a regenerative point of view and on a bit of a smaller scale too. And so we'll have some of that influenced throughout here. Okay, so when we talk about ground preparation, we are basically looking at about 3 steps, a 3-step process. We are looking at primary tillage, and with that primary tillage, you're looking to work the soil to about 6 to 12 inches deep. And then there's secondary tillage, which you're just looking at working the top few inches of the bed in order to create a nice fine seed bed. And then there's the stale seed bed technique, which is basically you're encouraging weeds to germinate. You're working these beds, you're doing your secondary tillage, and then you're going to pause for a week or 2, sometimes even 3, and you're going to allow and encourage weeds to germinate in order for you to eliminate them so that when you put your crop in, those weed seeds will have already exhausted themselves. And that's the stale seed bed technique. Okay, so first we'll talk about the primary tillage. As I was mentioning, you're looking at working the soil from about 6 to 12 inches deep with the primary tillage. And this can be accomplished either using, tractor equipment or hand equipment. The broad fork is a great tool to work the soil 12 inches deep. And the point of the primary tillage step is to incorporate crop residues and break up the soil compaction. Provide soil aeration, improve your drainage, and increase the depth of soil fertility. That's a quote from Elliot Coleman there. Usually the primary tillage is only done once in a season, even in like the conventional organic farming world. But in the regenerative kind of approach, you're looking at only ideally working the land hard once, and then from there, your primary tillage is done and over with, and you're only looking at either secondary tillage or maybe even a no-till under regenerative farming theory. Tools that are often used for their primary tillage is, especially if you're looking at tractor farming here, is your mold board plow or your chisel plow or a set of discs. Or in the small scale organic or regenerative farming realm, you have the broad fork there. And we got 2 broad forks on farm, and they are great tools for working the soil to that 12-inch depth. They're great. They're not so great for perhaps incorporating crop residues. That does get a little tricky. We'll talk about how to do that a little bit later. But it does break up that soil compaction really nice, provide that aeration, improves your drainage and your soil, the depth of soil fertility. The broad fork is great for all of those things. Okay, so the mold board plow. Well, let's talk about tractor equipment in general. Tractors are a neat thing. Anything that has been developed for a tractor all started out with a farmer in the field doing something by hand and thinking, man, this got to be a quicker way to do this. And so, things like a hoe, for example, a farmer in a field standing there with a hoe and you're hoeing your row and you're thinking, oh man, there's got to be a quicker way to do this. And then, yes, they mechanized it. First, of course, they went with horses and oxen, and then there's another step up to tractors. But any kind of tractor equipment all started out with kind of hand tools first. And then they went to tractor equipment. And now the curious thing is, as we are using our hand equipment, we're still looking at what those tractor operators are doing, because they figured out very efficient ways, very efficient tools. And so there's a lot to be learned from tractor farmers looking at people with hand tools and trying to duplicate that and size it up to tractors. And there's a lot of things to be learned from people using hand tools looking at people using tractors. There's a lot to be learned both ways. And that's what I'm kind of trying to introduce to you guys here. And so this here is your traditional, well, traditional in the sense of conventional agriculture, maybe not traditional in the sense of like the history of agriculture, but this here is your traditional tool for turning over the soil. And the whole point of a moldboard plow is to turn over your soil. It's literally flipping your soil. It's taking what's underneath, and here's a great picture of that. You know, between the two different plows, it's taking what's underneath the soil there, and then flipping it on top, and taking your sod on top and flipping it underneath. And you're basically flipping your soil with a moldboard plow. There's quite a bit of skill involved with working a moldboard plow, and I'll admit I have never, I used to run 2 tractors at my last operation, but I never did any of the plowing. That was always my father-in-law's job because he was very particular about it, and because you could see our fields from the road. And farmers take a lot of pride in their straight lines on their plowing, and my father-in-law wouldn't let me or my wife handle the plowing, and he always was out there doing the plowing because he didn't want to be embarrassed by our plowing job. And very funny to me. But the moldboard plow is the tool of choice to turn over sod into a workable garden. We'll talk about rototillering in a minute, but even better than working a rototill is the moldboard plow. To start with the moldboard plow and do that full flip. You can operate these on a small scale, meaning like say like the BCS tractor has a single furrow plow attachment that runs behind the BCS. So here you're seeing like this here, I think it's a four moldboard plows here operating together. This one here, 1, 2 is another 4, about the same thing. Here's a little bit larger one, but depending on the size and power of your tractor, you can operate as many of these plows as your tractor can handle. If I remember correctly, you're looking at about 15 horsepower per moldboard plow, is what they say. So that's your rule there. Previous to tractors, the moldboard plows were being pulled by horses and or teams of oxen. And I have even seen some pictures of humans operating a single furrow moldboard plow with somebody operating the single furrow plow and behind and 2 people pulling it along in the field. Yeah. So that's your moldboard plow. Great tool for flipping over the soil, turning sod into dirt. Next tool here we'll talk about is the chisel plow. Now you've seen me operate the BCS with that big soil hook on the back. That's exactly what this is here. The BCS, they call that a subsoiler hook. It's the exact same thing as a chisel plow does. The chisel plow does less, I was going to say damage, but less disturbance to the surface of the soil because you're only dragging that bar along. It's not flipping over the whole thing. But these big claws are going underneath the soil and breaking up any soil compaction and digging down to that 6 to 12 inch depth. And so this here is another primary tillage tool. Chisel plows can be run singly like the BCS. This here is a nice small one here for behind a tractor, a small tractor. And then of course you have, if you have a nice powerful tractor, and this here tractor is on tracks, if you have a nice powerful tractor, you can drag behind a much larger chisel plow. So disking. Disking is sometimes called a secondary tillage tool, but it can also be a primary tillage tool. It just depends on the size and the weight and the depth of your discs. So if you're looking at disking as a primary tillage tool, you're looking at having a heavy set of discs that can go down to 6 to 12 inches depth. Having these cutters on your discs as opposed to completely round will help your discs go in deeper and cut in further, making your discs a primary tillage tool. You'll also see discs under the secondary tillage tool options, because that's a different set of discs, a lighter set of discs that can only work the top few inches. But if you have a good set of discs that can bust through sod, and not every set of discs can, but if you have a good set of discs that can bust through sod, you'll be able to get down to that 6 to 12 inches, and you'll be able to incorporate all these crop residues. And that is an important thing for increasing your organic matter on a farm. So here you have a field that's been recently harvested. You see there either hay or straw harvest over here. And then they're coming back in, and all this stubble that's left over is being incorporated into the ground, adding all sorts of organic matter back into your soil. So here is a set of discs that's used for primary tillage. And then getting outside of the tractor realm, just hand tool kind of style, you got broad forks. And this is, like I say, we got 2 of these on the farm, although I think Claire has borrowed one recently, so we might only have 1 on the farm. But a lot of our fields were worked with a broad fork. I didn't own the BCS until the fall of 2018. So in the spring and summer of 2018, we broad forked the hell out of a lot of our fields in order to improve everything, like I was saying, the aeration, soil depth, fertility, drainage, compaction, and all that kind of stuff can be accomplished with a broad fork in a bit of time. These 2 here, smiling and happy people. There's no way in hell they broad forked that field. They would not be smiling and happy. It takes a lot of work. That is a very staged photo. And they have almost like raised beds and stuff. You don't do raised beds with the broad fork. The broad fork is just busting up soil compaction and getting in deep. Okay, so that's primary tillage stuff. Now we're going to move on to secondary tillage stuff. So when we talk about secondary tillage, we're talking about working just the top few inches of the soil. When you do your primary tillage, after you're done with the moldboard plow, that whole grass gets flipped and you end up with these clumps of soil. If you do the chisel plow, you're going to end up with clumps of soil because it has minimal disturbance on the top. So your secondary tillage is all about trying to break up those clumps of soil and further incorporate surface residues, and to try to create that fine seed bed, as they like to call it in the farming world, in order to seed your plants. The reason you want a nice fine seed bed, that means a nice crumbled soil, is to increase the soil to seed contact. If you have very blocky soil and you put in a seed, there's going to be air gaps around it, and that seed is not going to germinate as well. Seeds will germinate much better in soil that is very fine. So that's the whole point of the secondary tillage here. And often in the tractor world, when you're doing a secondary tillage, anywhere from 2 to 4 secondary passes are done. That means you're running these equipment here, which we'll go over in a second, over your field after the primary tillage. You're running these equipment over anywhere from 2 times to 4 times in order to create that fine seed bed. Tools that are used in the secondary tillage world here, we're talking about a different set of discs, sometimes called a disc harrow. We're also talking about a cultivator, a C-tine or S-tine cultivator that is. And then there's also harrows. They can come in diamond harrows or chain harrows, other ones besides that. Rototilling is often used as a secondary tillage method. However, in certain events, in certain cases, it is also used as a primary tillage if you don't have anything else. If you have like lawn out front and it's impossible to get in a moldboard plow, it's impossible to get in a disc, sometimes you just go straight to a rototiller. Less than ideal for different reasons that we talked about, because it encourages soil compaction. It's not great to keep rototillering a land over and over again, but sometimes rototillering is used as both a primary and secondary tillage tool. However, ideally, rototillering should only be a secondary tillage tool working the top few inches of the soil. It is better for you to get in there with a broad fork first, loosen everything up, and then the rototiller second as a secondary tillage tool. There's also something called a tilther, which we'll show a picture of and talk about in a second. And then, of course, we got our good old garden or digging fork and good old garden rakes. So when we talk about harrows, we're talking about, when we talk about discs, I mentioned discs under primary tillage tool. There is also discs that you can use as a secondary tillage tool, and these are lighter discs that are not going to work with your soil very deep. Only the few first inches of your soil will be worked with a series of light discs. Discs like this can be pulled by just 2 horses, or this here is more for tractor pulling or perhaps a team of horses. And these discs are intended not to work very deep at all. Then we got our cultivators. The cultivators look similar to the chisel plow, but again, not nearly as heavy, and will just work the top few inches of soil. I have seen some folks put weights on their cultivators in order to get it in further, depending on your soil type. But in general, they're often used without weights. They can be used behind a 4-wheeler sometimes, or small tractors. They can be used behind horses. Oh yes, the S-tine versus C-tine. Here we have an S-tine cultivator because it's very S-shaped, very curvy here. Where, oh, there we go, much better. We're very curvy here, whereas the C-tine cultivator is only in C, so only C shape. It doesn't, I know this picture's far away, but it doesn't have that S shape as this one does. They're only in C shape in there, so there are 2 different cultivators there. Then harrows. Harrows are even lighter than cultivators. Sometimes harrows are connected behind your discs if you're operating a tractor that is powerful enough to pull discs and a harrow. Sometimes harrows are also dragged behind the cultivator. The harrow will really break down seed clumps really nice, and the harrow is super great. You can see all these teeth on the harrow. The harrow is super great for dragging along the surface of the soil to take out twitchgrass roots that your primary or secondary tillage has brought to the surface. And then you drag along those harrows, and then you drag it to the end of the field, you shake it free of your twitchgrass roots, and then clear it, and then get back in your tractor and drag it again, get out of your tractor, take out your twitchgrass roots. There's a lot of getting in and getting out. Harrows are great tools for producing that very fine seed bed. Even your secondary discs will end up with a little bit of clumps, but after you drag your harrow along, it really breaks down those clumps very well. Here's a picture of diamond harrows, and if you're able to get a very good close-up of each one of these spikes, they're kind of diamond shaped, hence the name diamond harrows. Whereas these ones here are your chain harrows. Chain harrows, this here is a very either small tractor or a 4-wheeler that you can drag it behind. But chain harrows can also be quite large. You see one here that has the wings that fold down, and they can get way larger than that. We're talking about rototillers as a secondary tillage tool. Ideally, it's nice to be able to just work the top few inches with your rototiller. If you're using your rototiller as a primary tillage tool, then you're trying to go down a little bit deep. There are, of course, various sizes of rototillers from like a 4-foot or 6-foot behind the tractor rototiller. 6 foot is the largest I've ever seen. There may be 8 foots out there, I don't know. And then you got your medium scale tillers, and this here is a BCS tiller, much like you've seen me operate on the farm. And if any of you guys are inclined, I can give you a course in BCS in here and how that works on the farm. Matt has worked it so far. Shireen often works it, and we can give you guys a lesson here. The best thing about this picture, though, is this guy's badass leather kilt, right? Isn't that badass? And then, of course, you got some small rototillers too. It's just single-purpose rototiller machines. Tilther. This here is a tool that's credited to Elliot Coleman for inventing. This here is operated. Do you see this here? That is a cordless drill. So your tilther underneath it will have these little kind of rototiller type blades underneath it. It's only meant to work like 1 inch or 2 of the soil at the most. It's a very light machine, only intended just to work the very top of your beds. But you insert your cordless drill. It has a string that goes up. See, you can see it in this picture. It has a string that goes up, and you work that string with your hand. And that string basically has a little tool here that turns your cordless drill on and off. You let go of the string, it turns off. You pull the string back, it turns on. and your cordless drill powers the blades, and it's just a very small, lightweight version of a rototiller. Kind of brilliant. Then, of course, you have your good old garden rake. I believe everybody knows how to use that. And of course, you have your good old digging fork. Digging forks work well after broad forking. The broad fork breaks up any compaction, it goes in real deep, and the digging fork is just working the top few inches of the soil. Okay, then we're talking about that stale seed bed technique, and I've been talking about this a little bit here and there, and I often get questions about it, so we'll revisit our stale seed bed technique again here. That technique is all about purposely allowing the weeds to germinate, which a lot of people go, oh my goodness, you don't want the weeds to germinate, but you want them to germinate so that you can come back and eliminate them. And then you'll reduce weed pressure on whatever crop that you plan to grow in that area. So after that secondary tillage, and sometimes, like I was saying, that secondary tillage takes more than one pass. Sometimes you do it 2, 3, 4 times for that secondary tillage. Then you're going to let that prepared area lie fallow, just dormant for a week or 2 or 3. And then you're going to allow those weeds to germinate and just, you know, encourage them to come up and do their thing. And then you're going to gently work the very, very top of that soil with some sort of very light implement. On a tractor scale, that could be your harrows there, that diamond harrows or chain harrows. It could be something called a tine weeder, and we'll take a look at that too in the picture. It could be something just like a garden rake. It could be your stirrup hoe, could be just a traditional hoe. You're just trying to work that top ½ inch to 1 inch of soil. And you're trying to avoid bringing any new weed seeds to the surface while you do it. So that's why you're just trying to work it very, very fine. There's also a tool out there called the flame weeder that some farmers use, and we'll take a look at those things too. So harrows, we already talked about harrows, exact same tool. This is what you would use behind the tractor if you're doing like by the acreage. You're doing that fine seed bed, and you're going to let things germinate, and then you're going to run the harrows through again to kill any of those weeds as they germinate. This here is a tine weeder, and like it's you have to calibrate it. It works well in tractor farming after you have your seeder calibrated to a certain distance, then your tine weeder goes in behind, and they're just all these little fingers that run through the rows. And no matter what you're planting, no matter what you're growing, whether it's grain crops or vegetable crops, you can move and change these tines however you want them, get them as close or as far away from your plants as possible, and you're just going to run that over your bed in order to weed your garden. See this sweet ass tractor? I used to have this guy. This here is an International A Cub tractor. Even the name is cute, Cub tractor. The great thing about this tractor is as you sit here in the driver's seat, there is implements here that do go behind it, but many of your implements as you're sitting on this tractor is going underneath the tractor right here. Oh, right here. And so then as you're driving the tractor, you are literally driving a tractor over top of your crops. And then you have these little tines here all set up underneath you. And so you get to watch as you're driving, and you get to watch, make sure that your scufflers here, as they're sometimes called, or the tines, are going in between your plants and not taking out your plants. And that is super useful because, as I'm sure you're aware, most tractor equipment is dragged behind you. So if you're trying to scuffle a crop of, I don't know, say lettuce with something like these tine weeders, you'd constantly be looking over your shoulder to see if you're doing it right or if you're taking out a whole row of lettuce. Whereas with this here cute little Cub tractor, you get to look down on top of your row of lettuce, make sure you're straddling it correctly, and you get to see the weeding happen right underneath you. I was saying I used to weed a couple of acres with a wheel hoe. This was previous to buying this here tractor. After buying this here tractor, this was our scuffling tractor. And then that we changed from using the wheel hoe predominantly to weed to using this Cub tractor, which was a great tool. I could go on about that tractor, but I won't. Instead, we'll talk about flame weeders. So flame weeders are exactly what they sound. You're looking at a propane tank, sometimes mounted to your back. I like to pull it behind me, use it a little bit of a dolly. They can be single like this. I have this version at home. They can be single where there's just a flame shooting out and you're literally torching whatever weeds that you see. This here is one that is designed to fit over an entire garden bed. And then there are behind the tractor flame weeders here too, which look pretty dangerous, I'll admit. But the whole point of the flame weeder is that you don't disturb the soil at all. Yeah, whereas when you're stale seed bedding, and I'm talking about working that top ½ inch to 1 inch, sometimes you're bringing up more seeds to the soil surface. Whereas with the flame weeder, there is zero soil disturbance going on, and you're just literally torching your weeds. Now that we tried this out for a little while, I have found that the single flame weeder is less than ideal. It really depends on your environmental conditions. You can't use it too early in the morning when there's dew on the plants, otherwise it's going to take you 3 times as long to kill that plant, like each individual plant. You can't use it on windy days as well. I have found the best application for it is weeding in a hoop house where you can control the wind and control the moisture. It works really well for weeding in a hoop house. But overall, I have found more use for my single flame weeder like this guy for dehairing pigs. They work really well to dehair pigs. But for the garden applications, I have stopped using my flame weeder in my garden. I didn't think it was very useful. Perhaps one like this with a shield. I've heard the shield really helps to keep the flames where you want it to be on windy days, and it helps. I heard the shield one helps. I don't know. I find flame weeders a little bit gimmicky, but I do know farmers that have played around with these guys. BCS tiller. Here is a link to BCS America in case you wanted to go do some more research on BCS. I swear I don't work for BCS, but they are a great tool for small scale farmers. They really don't use much fuel at all, although of course they do use some. Any piece of equipment that you can find to fit on the back of a tractor, there is an attachment for a BCS. Every small scale gardener that I know that has a BCS loves the machine, and that encouraged me to go buy mine a couple of years ago now. It can allow one grower to manage significantly more area than without one, but yeah, that's my BCS plug. They're a great tool to have around. They work super well. I know farmers with tractors that also own a BCS just to use inside their greenhouse operations and that kind of stuff, because there's areas on the farm that are too tight to be able to get in there with your tractor. All right, that's my BCS plug. Okay. So we went over some tillage and cultivation tools. Now we're going to bring in that fertility management aspect and find out when it's best to apply these different approaches to your primary and secondary tillage approaches. When we are addressing fertility management here today, we're looking at large-scale fertility management practices and not individual boosts to individual plants. For instance, strawberries like high calcium, for example, and magnesium. But we're not going to talk about specific plants like strawberries. We're talking about full farm fertility management. And all farm fertility management needs to be planned ahead of time, especially if using manure. There are strict regulations in certified organic farming world about when you can use manure and how it can be used. And if you're interested in being a certified organic farm, these are things that you need to talk about with your certifying body to make sure that you are using your manure correctly. Otherwise, folk can get sick out there. And I'm sure all of you guys have heard about recalls for E. coli and whatnot, salmonella and that kind of stuff. And that can happen with using manure incorrectly. It can also happen with various other things, but manure is another item that can happen with. So you got to make sure that you're using your manure correctly. Okay, so the 4 most common options on an organic market garden scale for fertility management is often compost applications, manure applications, cover cropping, and rock and mineral dusts. Those are the four most common. Of course, there's other things that can be used, and we'll talk about a few other those things later, but those are the most common ones. So compost, let's talk about compost. We've already had a class on compost, so we're not going to go into the theory behind building the compost, but more about when to apply. And your compost is best added after your primary tillage and before your secondary tillage, or if you're planning to do a couple of secondary tillages in between those secondary tillages. And again, that secondary tillage is just to incorporate that top few inches of soil, and that's where your compost is best applied, in that top few inches of the soil. If you're not tilling whatsoever, if you're taking the regenerative farming approach, compost can be applied as a top dressing, and it will still infiltrate through your soil a little bit more slowly. It'll still help out your soil kind of open up. It'll still help out your soil collect more moisture in rain events and release it slowly too. So top dressing is a complete option with composting as well. And it's always best to add only finished compost to your garden. If the compost is high in woody, like your brown materials that we were talking about in compost building, you should continue to let it decompose. In our compost class, we are talking that your compost is finished when you can't recognize anything that's in your finished compost. If you pick up a handful of compost and you can still pick out, oh, that's pieces of corn cob, oh, that's a piece of leaf, then your compost is probably not finished. Okay, so we are talking about manure applications and when is the best time to apply manure. And basically the answer to that is it should be applied long before any vegetable crops will be planted. Especially if it's a vegetable crop that you're growing for like leaf, like kale or chard or something like that. Other plants that grow up a little bit taller and then you're harvesting for fruit, maybe not as critical, like tomato plants, let's say, but anything that's close to the ground, definitely you want to have it applied long before the vegetable crops will be planted. That said, it's often best applied in the fall and then incorporated in the spring with either primary or secondary tillage. And then that area could be planted in the summer. As I was saying, especially if you're certified, it's always best to check with your local certification office for up-to-date application recommendations to make sure you don't lose your certification for applying it at the wrong time, because there can be serious health risks if applied incorrectly. In my opinion, and I got this from talking to a certified organic body in the Kawartha Lakes, your absolute best practice when it comes to manure is to follow your manure application with a cover crop, and then incorporate that cover crop into your garden, and then follow that cover crop with a fruit and or vegetable crop. So in this case, you would be applying the manure in the fall, and then incorporate it in spring. That looks like a primary or secondary tillage. And then cover crop it with something like oats and peas, which is a very quick cover crop, and you can grow that in just like 4 to 6 weeks. And you can grow that in the cool part of the season, in the mid-springish. Then you plow that down into your field, and we'll talk about how to do that in a second, how to incorporate cover crops. And then plant a crop after that. And then that area will be incredibly well fertilized, benefit from the organic matter from the cover crop. That cover crop will have made that manure that you applied even more available to your plants. That is an excellent way to apply manure, is to follow that manure application with a cover crop. And you certainly won't run into any health risks that way. So when we talk about applying manure, especially on like a farmy kind of tractor scale, often you're talking about manure spreaders. And a manure spreader is, we used to call ours a shit flinger, and it has these big blades at the back that will fling poop very far and look at it go. It has a conveyor belt on the bottom, so you pack this thing full of your bedding, your manure, whatever you got, and then there's a conveyor belt that as you drive, that conveyor belt brings everything to the back, and then it gets flung out the back all over your field in a big wide dispersal rate. There are smaller versions of a manure spreader. This one here is made for the back of a four-wheeler. And then this one here is made for, obviously it's a bit old and antique, but it's made for horses. It's what's known as ground driven or ground propelled, because as the horses pull it, these wheels do all the work of the manure spreader. And they will move that conveyor belt back and fling the poop out the back at the same time. Whereas this one here, the modern manure spreader, is connected to something on your tractor called your PTO shaft, which is a very fast spinning shaft on the back of your tractor, and that is what operates the flinger there. Oops. That's what operates the flinger there. Whereas this one here is all completely ground driven and can be operated by horses. Now, besides that, previous to buying a manure spreader at my old farm, we used to just load up a wagon full of poop, borrow a tractor from a neighbor, and we used to go out into our field and just fling it off with forks. That's the way you got to do it sometimes. On a smaller scale, of course, you're just looking at a wheelbarrow there and a hay fork to spread any manure or bedding. And then there's also liquid manure systems, but we won't get into that so much because I don't think any of you do that for a while. They can get stinky, liquid manure systems. Okay, so we talked about compost, we talked about manure. Cover cropping. Cover cropping is an option for growers that don't want to include livestock in their fertility management plan. I know there is a movement or an association or whatnot of farmers that they call themselves stock-free farmers, and they're just farms without any animals whatsoever, intentionally, and they rely on cover cropping for much of their fertility management. Cover cropping is also referred to sometimes as green manure cropping, because you're basically making a manure out of your green crops. So cover cropping is used to improve your soil tilth, like that's your ability to kind of work your soil fertility. They will greatly reduce your weed pressure by crowding out weeds, and if used properly, can help diversify the farm ecosystem. And we'll talk about that in a second. A nice, thick, healthy cover crop can take as much as 1.5 to 4 weeks to properly incorporate into your soil. That will depend on the life of your soil. The more soil life you have, the more macro and microorganisms, the more microbes, bacteria, and fungal life you have in your soil, the quicker that decomposition is going to be. So if you are planning to increase your fertility on your farm with cover cropping, again, you're going to need to plan ahead here to make sure that they have sufficient time to decompose before your plantings. It's all just a matter of mapping it out and working backwards from when you want to plant to how long it's going to take to decompose, to how long it's going to take to grow, to how long it's going to take to germinate. You just kind of work it all backwards for timing. Cover crops are good to be grown either before or after vegetable crops. If you have an area of your garden that you know that you're going to put only heat-loving plants in that won't tolerate a frost, you can cover crop that area ahead of time and then incorporate that cover crop and then put in your heat-loving crops. Or if you have a crop that, say like garlic, that gets harvested out end of July, early August, something like that, then you can choose to grow a cover crop in that area for the rest of the season afterwards. Okay, so this here is according to the Canadian Organic Grower Book. They talk about the three most popular cover crop combinations that are used in Canada are often pea and oats, straight buckwheat, and rye and clover. Although that rye can also be substituted with oats or barley, and that clover can also be substituted with alfalfa or vetch. And we'll talk about all of those in a little bit more detail here. And if you have any questions, please, you can shout them out at any time. Stop me. Feel free to interrupt me. Cover cropping always kind of seems to bring up some questions. So let's talk about the pea and oat combination. Pea and oats are very useful because they are super quick growing and they are cold hardy, meaning that they will grow in the early part of the season when you're still experiencing frosts, and they can grow well at the late part of the season when you start to get frosts again. Depending on your soil or your field conditions and your soil drainage, they can be seeded as early as April, like towards the end of April in these parts. And then they can be incorporated into the soil even sooner. I'd say even like May or June, perhaps, depends on how they're growing and how far you want to take them. And another window for growing these is either that early spring window or getting into that fall window, and you seed them in late summer in August or September. And then you grow them well into the fall, and then you allow them to be winter killed. And that is an important thing about peas and oats, is that they are winter killed. So if you do grow that fall crop of pea and oats, which is a great thing to grow, they will get completely killed in the winter. And then come the spring, you're going to end up with what looks like straw on your garden or in your beds or wherever you grew this in, and you just got to work that in. You got to incorporate that into your soil afterwards. Here's a bit of information on seeding rates if you ever wanted to use oats and peas as a cover crop for your garden or for on an acreage kind of level. Now, the good thing about peas and oats is they provide that NPK, and that's why they are a popular cover crop to be grown. Oats will take up excess nitrogen in the soils and then small amounts of potassium or phosphorus and potassium. And then peas will fix nitrogen, making nitrogen available for your next crop. So the oat-pea combination provides that NPK for your crop, which is your macronutrients, and well, that's what a lot of the conventional farmers are mostly concerned about, is your NPK. Now, whereas oats and peas are your good shoulder season crops, your early spring and getting into your fall, they're good cover crops for those. Your buckwheat, actually, let's go back and talk about oats and peas for a second. Properly managed, if you grow oats and peas, you're growing them. Well, first of all, the reason you're growing the oats is the oats germinate faster than the peas, and they'll provide a stalk. And then as those peas germinate, they actually climb up the oat stalk. And the oats are considered a nurse crop in this here because they're nursing along the peas. And if you're growing this correctly, you want to wait till the peas flower, and that doesn't take very long. That only takes like 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks, depends on the type of peas that you're growing. And you'll end up with a whole, like if you're doing this by the acreage, you'll end up with a whole sea of white flowers, these white pea flowers. And they're all great. They're all perfectly edible. And I often will try to harvest that as a crop and make it available at market, back when I was doing market. And the pea flowers sell like crazy. And it's a great way to be able to cover crop your field and make a harvest out of it at the same time. The pea flowers taste exactly like peas. They are so tasty, and they make a salad look so beautiful, and they're a great little garnish, and I used to sell quite a bit of pea flowers. All right, so whereas oats and peas are your shoulder crops, buckwheat is your heat-loving crop. It will not tolerate a frost. It is a very quick-growing, heat-loving cover crop for the summertime, and it grows these very nice broad leaves that shade out weeds. Buckwheat is also slightly allelopathic, so it will produce slight toxins that will keep your weeds pressure down. It likes to bully any neighboring weeds. Buckwheat is often seeded on a farm anytime from after that last frost. So actually these dates are probably a little bit wrong. You can probably go from like June to early September. The problem with planting it in June is buckwheats will go to flower pretty quick, like maybe like 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the variety of buckwheat that you're planting. And once it goes to flower, the next thing it does is going to set seed. And you don't want it to set seed in your garden because buckwheat can become a weed in your garden. If you do plant it in June, you got to watch out that it doesn't fully mature and drop seed all over your garden. That could be a problem. So often it is seeded from a little bit later in July to early September, depends on your region. And then you allow that frost to come and kill your buckwheat for you. And just like I was saying about oats and peas being winter killed, as soon as that frost comes, it will kill your buckwheat crop. And then the whole crop will lie down and basically become straw for your garden or your field or whatever you happen to be at. Here is a seeding rate in case anybody's interested in playing with buckwheat. We will be growing some buckwheat on the sides of our potatoes this year, potato hills. I was told, and a little bit of research doubled this, backed it up, where I was told that growing buckwheat with potatoes will help keep away the potato bug. So we're gonna give it a try. Buckwheat is very good for adding organic matter to the soil. It produces quite a bit of biomass. It will grow waist high. You can plant it quite close to each other, and it'll provide, like, literally looks like a sea of buckwheat out there. You can just go out in your buckwheat crop and take a seat and you'll disappear completely. So it adds quite a bit of organic matter to the soil. And then it also embodies phosphorus and calcium into the buckwheat plant itself. And when that buckwheat plant dies, it makes it more accessible to the crops that follow it. Okay, so this one here is your rye and clover combo. Now, just like when I was talking about peas and oats, your ryegrass here is your nurse crop. And then your clover crop is your nitrogen fixing crop that you really want to establish. And you're just using this rye or oats or barley, you can use either of those as a nurse crop in order to help that clover grow underneath it. Especially in the middle of summer, if you're seeding clover, clover seems to germinate best with a little bit of shade and a little bit more moisture. So you're seeding both of these things at the same time, and that rye is going to come up first, and then that clover is going to come up underneath it. It's going to take a little bit more time to germinate, and that rye is going to create better conditions for that clover to germinate. Ryegrass will overwinter though, whereas if you plant clover with, say, oats or barley, those oats or barley are going to be winter killed. And then the next year, you're going to be left with just clover in that field. And if that's what you're intending, that's great. That's the best way to establish a clover field. Whereas if you plant clover and rye together, that rye will come back the next year and grow quite vigorously with that clover, and you'll end up with a field of both clover and rye. We grew ryegrass on the farm this year. That is where all those little flower areas are going to be seeded. It was all in ryegrass. And they were starting to form little seed heads already. They were very immature seed heads, but they were starting to form seed heads already in like early June. And so that ryegrass was seeded last fall and then comes back in spring and then starts to go to seed. Clover, it's great. Clover is a great nitrogen fixer. Clover is a great organic matter addition to it. It will produce quite a bit of biomass on your farm or on your garden bed or wherever it happens to be. Clover is a great cover crop. And like I said, it can be established under the rye or under oats or under barley as the nurse crop. But another option instead of using clover is you can do the same thing with alfalfa or vetch and grow those underneath those rye or barley or oat crop. And then the oats and barley in particular will winter kill, and then the next year you end up with a full field of either alfalfa or vetch. We used to grow quite a bit of clover at Grassroot Organics. That was a good cover crop for us. I like clover a whole lot. And then even this spring, we were trying to establish clover as a cover crop around the perimeters of our garden because it's a great nitrogen fixer. It is great for biomass. It'll produce a whole bunch of organic matter for the soil. Clover is a great cover crop. So your rye and your clover combination are they're more long-term cover crops, where your oats and peas were quick, your buckwheat is quick, your rye and clover is a long-term cold hardy cover crop that will overwinter and then come back early the next year. They can be seeded on the farm or on a garden scale anytime from July to early October. The rye or oats or barley, I'll put in there too, acts as the nurse crop and helps the clover to grow. The rye overwinters, but barley or oats will not. Then that could leave you with just a straight clover field for the next season, if that's your intention. The clover fixes the nitrogen, but like I was saying, the clover has quite a bit of biomass to it, and it can take up to 4 to 5 weeks to incorporate into your soil and with using those primary and secondary tillage tools. Seeding rate is here. Clover seed is quite small, quite fine, a very grass-like seed, and it doesn't take very much at all to cover an acre. However, clover seed is quite expensive, so even though it doesn't take very much, it will cost you about the same amount as seeding 60 pounds of rye. Okay, so if you're cover cropping, now this is where I love cover cropping. I used to do a lot of cover cropping at Grassroot Organics, and I don't do nearly as much cover cropping as I used to do here at Hayes Farm. And the reason for that is the incorporation of the cover crop. And that can be tricky in regenerative farming. There is much value in growing cover crops if you can be able to incorporate them into the soil. So here on a tractor kind of scale, what you're looking at is a flail mower here. And what flail mower doing is it's taking these tall grasses and it's chopping them up into pieces and laying them flat onto the soil. Here is another flail mower for a four-wheeler attachment. And then this one here is what's called a crop chopper. And this tool was originally used for making silage on the farm. We won't go into silage now, but the whole point of this one here is it takes whatever crop that you have in your field and chops it up pretty fine and then throws it out through a chute. In this case, they're collecting it because they want to use it for silage, for animal feed. But if you're using it for a cover crop and for fertility management, you would be driving this without the wagon on the back because you just want to be able to chop that crop and then put it back onto your field in order to let it rot and feed your field, add organic matter to your field, add nutrients to your field. Now, my problem though with this in the regenerative farming world, especially if you're going with permanent raised beds, is I do grow cover crops on those, especially in the fall. I will use peas in the fall in particular because those peas will be winter killed. And so some beds, instead of receiving a heavy mulch in the fall, they'll just receive a seeding of peas, and the peas will act as a cover crop and cover that bed for the winter, and then they'll be winter killed, and come the spring, then you're able to use that bed again. But peas are just like one cover crop, right? There are, of course, many, many other cover crops. But in the regenerative farming world, it's difficult to be able to incorporate them. It's difficult to be able to chop them up into reasonably sized pieces instead of these long, long grasses that take forever to break down. It's best to be able to incorporate them by chopping them into smaller pieces. And it's difficult to do in the regenerative farming world. I haven't really figured out a good system. Some people have recommended scythes, which sounds super interesting. However, a scythe is made to cut the grass really long, not into pieces. And it'd be awkward, I think, to use a scythe in order to cut things into pieces. There is a flail mower attachment for the BCS, but it's quite expensive. It's like $3,000 for the flail mower attachment, so I haven't bought it yet. But I would love to be able to incorporate more cover cropping into Hayes Farm, but I just haven't figured out a good way to do that yet. Okay, so another common option for fertility management on organic farms is rock or mineral dusts. And we talked about these during our soil lecture. Rock or mineral dust can be from many different things, from calcium sources to gypsum sources, you know, all sorts of different stuff. Before applying any rocks or mineral dust, you definitely need to do a soil test in order to determine what you need to add and how much you need to add of it. Any good soil test lab will recommend specific types and the quantities of rock dust for your farm and garden. They're very easy to work with. I've done this before at Grassroot Organics and got a whole recommendation of different rock dusts. Except I never really did apply them at Grassroot Organics because they would have cost a couple $1,000 was the recommendation for the rock dust, and I didn't have a tool in order to incorporate them or to apply them to the farm at the moment, so I never actually did apply them. But any good soil lab test will give you a recommendation of what rock dusts you need. And rock dusts are best applied after a primary tillage, but before a secondary tillage. Then if you are using a no-till, like regenerative farming kind of techniques, they can be applied as a top dressing. And that's exactly what we do with our lime, our agricultural lime. That is just ground limestone, which is a rock, and we're using it in the ground form. We're basically using it as a rock dust, and we apply lime as a top dressing to our fields. Now, if you have sandy soil, that lime will incorporate and be useful to your plants much more sooner than if you have clay soil. If you remember from our soil lecture, there's much more porosity in sandy soils and allows that lime to get into your soils, whereas clay soils are much tighter and it just takes more time for that lime to incorporate into the soils, especially as a top dressing. Yeah, we covered many of these in our working with soil lectures, such as magnesium sources and carbon sources and calcium and sulfur and all those kind of good stuff. So other popular options for boosting plants during the season is when top dressing, and we talked about this term a few times, or I mentioned this term a few times, and top dressing is literally just applying things around the tops of plants. You're just spreading a thin, even layer of compost or composted manure or other fertilizers around your plants, rock dusts, whatever it happens to be, and allowing the rainwater to bring the nutrients down into your plants. There's foliar sprays. I'm sure you guys are familiar with some foliar sprays, and these are liquidized fertilizers that are sprayed directly onto a plant's leaves, and you want to try to incorporate the tops of the leaves as well as the bottom of the leaves where many of the stomata are, those leaf openings are, as opposed to putting it directly into the soil. Although you can spray liquid fertilizers onto your soil too, but when we talk about a foliar spray, you're typically applying it just to the plants. We've also talked about compost tea brewing. This here is a brew that's made to incorporate many microbes into your garden. You're taking some aged, like fully made compost, steeping that into water, adding various amendments. You're putting a bubbler in there in order to make it nice and frothy. Got to monitor it, and we got to apply it at the right time so your microbe populations don't crash. But compost tea brewing is another popular fertility management, especially on a smaller scale on different farms. So when we talk about top dressing, different materials that can be used there is finished compost, finished manure, vermicompost, bat guano, liquid fertilizers, kelp, alfalfa, volcanic ash is another one that's available, green sand, we've talked about bone meal and blood meal, have both been mentioned previous too. When you're talking about foliar sprays, you can be putting into your sprayer compost teas, fish or kelp emulsions. You can purchase and make water soluble bone and blood meal, or make liquid teas, kind of like biodynamic preparation is what I mean by the green teas there. Compost tea brewing, yeah, we were talking about different amendments, and the bubbler and a large barrel is what's needed there, and some finished compost, and often molasses is added to compost tea brewing. All right, I still got more after this here, just kind of concluding. This here is referring to concluding the Canadian organic grower kind of section of this lecture. We talked about various primary, secondary tillage techniques, stale seed bedding. We've talked about fertility management with compost applications, manure applications, cover cropping, and supplementing with top dressing, foliar sprays, compost teas, and rocks and mineral dusts. And there's a ton more information out there. But now I'm trying to move away from kind of that conventional certified organic kind of approach that the Canadian Organic Grower book takes. And I'd like to kind of move into more of a regenerative farming lens. And I've been trying to introduce these kind of theories as I go through. But if you have any questions or any comments as we go through, please let me know. As I mentioned before, primary and secondary tillage should be done only once under a regenerative farming technique. Often that is done using machinery, such as you see out in field block 9 right now, but only once. And I'm not talking about like working it just once. I'm talking about like working it like in its entirety just once, because you've seen us out there with the BCS a few times now. And I just mean that like that once initial month of working it, and then after that left alone for ideally its entirety. The only exception to that is something I'm planning to do with our field blocks once we have all of our field blocks online and working. Right now we're up to 9 different field blocks. What I have in mind here at Hayes Farm is to take one field block off a year to let it rest, and then do a cover crop on that field block and basically allow a fallow period to restore its fertility and kind of rest an area. And so I would like to do that with our field blocks like once every 9 years in a 9-year rotation. Take one field block off at a time, work it with the BCS, cover crop it for an entire season, and then rework it with the BCS next season, and then get it back in line and make new beds and do the whole thing again. And I'd like to march that around the farm in order to increase our fertility and add organic matter to different field areas. Yeah, so that is later in this lecture here. We're gonna be talking about different ideas to increase fertility management at Hayes Farm, and that is one of my ideas that I'd like to do. And so I was mentioning that primary and secondary tillage, I only like to do it once, but here is an exception, is if you're gonna take an area offline for a year to rest it and cover crop it, which is a great practice to do for both fertility and weed management. In that case, I kind of make an exception, and I will retill at that time. And the reason I am so adamant about only working the area once is all about that fungal layer in the soil. Well, that's one of the reasons anyway. We also talked about microbes, and there's air-loving microbes and microbes that live in the soil that don't like air so much. And when you till, you're flipping that around. You're bringing the air-loving ones down into the soil. You're bringing those soil-loving ones down up in the air, and you're killing your microbes. But you're also killing your soil mycorrhizae. That mycorrhizae is a fungal layer, a whole web that happens in the soil. It creates a symbiotic relationship between funguses and plants. The fungi colonizes the root systems of the host plant and provides increased water and nutrient absorption capabilities to that plant, while that plant provides that fungus with carbohydrates formed from photosynthesis. So a good symbiotic relationship. And the more that you till your soil, either primary or secondary tillage style, the more you're disturbing that soil mycorrhizae. Now, when you're doing that stale seed bed technique and you're only working that top ½ inch of soil or so, you're not disturbing that soil mycorrhizae so much. And so I encourage that stale seed bed technique, but discourage continual tillage, either primary or secondary. So that secondary or that stale seed bed, as mentioned, that's something I still like to use in the regenerative farming approach. It's a matter of kind of opening up the beds where you're just taking off that mulch that we like to apply in the fall, and then letting first removing any unwanted vegetation that is overwintered, and then And then you have the option of either remulching it or leaving it open. Sure. Okay. So here at the Hayes Farm, I understand what I'm trying to get at here. So here at the Hayes Farm, I've been encouraging everybody in the stale seed bed technique to take the mulch off of their beds, do that weeding, and then leave that mulch off in order to encourage weeds to come up. However, at my like homestead garden back at Crocs Point Road, I will open up that mulch, do my weeding, and then put that mulch all back onto the bed afterwards until I'm ready to plant. So there's two different approaches with that stale seed bed technique. Can anyone think of any advantages or disadvantages to those two different approaches? Why at Hayes Farm do I like to take the mulch off and leave it off for a couple of weeks versus at my home garden, I like to take off the mulch, do my weeding, and put the mulch back on? Well, it's all about the soil types. Here at the Hayes Farm, we have a clay soil that retains a lot of moisture. It might look dry on the very top, but if you start scratching down into your beds, you'll notice that it retains quite a bit of moisture. Because our soil retains quite a bit of moisture, I like to leave that mulch off and let that moisture kind of either dry up a little bit and or let those beds warm up a little bit. Whereas at my home garden, I got a very sandy soil. And I find if I do the same approach at my home garden, take off that mulch and let it sit open for 2 to 3 weeks, my soil dries out considerably. And it's not as nice anyway. So when you talk about stale seed bedding, I love that stale seed bed approach, highly recommend it. Except you gotta alter your stale seed bed approach based on your soil type. Here at Hayes Farm with heavy clay soil, I like to leave it open for a week to 2 to 3, whereas at home with sandy, silty soil, I like to cover it up in between. So there is no one size fits all. It's a matter of knowing your farm, knowing your soil type, knowing your ecosystem, and deciding what's best for that. So here's something I wanted to throw in here as something that wasn't mentioned in the Canadian Organic Grower book at all in the fertility management department, and that is adding additional organic matter, which is mulching. Typically, mulching isn't done on a conventional organic scale when you're using tractors because it kind of gets in the way. There's a big pain in the bum to mulch heavily if you're using a tractor. However, on a regenerative farming scale, it makes a lot of good sense to mulch. And the whole point of a mulch in the regenerative farming world is all about the microbes, all about feeding your macro and microorganisms and making that healthy soil food web circle complete. Because mulch is microbe food, especially if carefully chosen. And as we've been talking about, increasing your organic matter content, which is accomplished by mulching, can improve your soil texture, your soil health, your soil food web health, and retain and release more water for your plants. The cover cropping, the green manure cover cropping we were talking about, is also a great way to add mulch to your soil in that kind of tractory kind of world. But if you're in a more of a human scale kind of operation, adding mulch is a good way to go for sure. And as I was mentioning, mulching's not often done on those large organic farms. Mulch can get in the way of a lot of your tractor equipment and kind of bung it up. And instead, tractors are used for mechanical weed control as opposed to applying mulch for your weed control. And then that is less labor and therefore less cost. And then those large organic farms are always concerned with slugs and slug control problems by using mulch, and mulch does encourage slug growth, and that's something that we always have to watch out for when applying mulch, is keep an eye out on those slugs and stay on top of those slug situations. And this is why I keep talking to you guys about slugs often. So when we talk about those common options for fertility management techniques, we're talking about compost applications, manure applications, and cover crops, and rocks and mineral dust. I have one missing here. There should be 4 most common. These are all also applicable to regenerative farming. However, when I was talking about cover cropping so far, I have given you just those really common cover crop combinations that has been recommended in the Canadian Organic Grower book. However, in the regenerative farming world, even those regenerative farmers that are operating on a tractor kind of level, what is being done more and more often are called cover cropping cocktails. And this is kind of duplicating what is often seen in nature, because rarely in nature do you ever see a large field that is growing with just like 1 or 2 plants in that ecosystem. Often it's made up of many, many different ecosystems, or many different plants in one ecosystem. When you're talking about cover crop cocktails, these can include anything from like 3 to 4 to 5 different cover crops you're going to mix together all at once and seed all at once. Or sometimes people talk up to like 20 to 30 different cover crops all being mixed into one and then seeded onto a field. Some of these cover crops, if you're doing a whole cocktail of like 20 different cover crops, some of them will take much better than others. And especially depending on your seasonality, if it's a cooler season, if it's a hotter season, if it's a drier season, if it's a wetter season, some crops will just naturally take off. And some people look at that and go, oh, why bother putting that into your cocktail if it's not going to take off? But what happens is just, it depends on your seasonality, and some will just do better than others. And by doing a cover crop cocktail of 20 different ones, you're really covering all your bases. And no matter what nature throws at you, you should have something in that cocktail that is going to dominate and take over that field. And the other ones will just be a little bit minor players. And then if you have all of those different plants going out to the field, you have them all taking up different nutrients in that field and embodying it into those plants. I'm a big fan of the cover crop cocktail. The more I read about that, the more I kind of want to go in that direction. Okay, so then in the regenerative farming lens, when I was talking about incorporating cover crops, if we are trying not to till, and that is an important tool in that conventional organic farming world, is to incorporate your cover crops, to chop them up with that flail mower or that crop mower, and then hit them with the discs afterwards, or a plow, or whatever you happen to be doing, to incorporate them into your soil. But in the regenerative farming world, if we are not looking to disturb our soil and we are planting a cover crop, some cover crops will need to be killed because they won't be winter killed. So some cover crops will need to be killed by you. Does anyone have any ideas of how to kill a cover crop without tilling it?
We used the black plastic for that purpose, I think, didn't we?
Well, in this case, sure, that could work maybe after you're done mowing it. You would have to be able to mow it and chop it and then tarp it, and that would be a way to be able to kill that cover crop. Except now you're in a situation where you're trying to either mow or chop that cover crop down, and I don't know a tool for that one either. You know what I mean? Because if you have a waist high, say if you have a waist high cover crop, and then you go in there with a black tarp to try to kill it, your black tarp is just going to lay on top of it. It's going to take a lot of effort to try to get it flat.
What about those big old sickles?
Yeah, that is one way. There's the scythe, there's sickles, and then that will cut your cover crop very tall and allow it to fall, but it won't chop it very much. But that's okay. If you cut it tall and let it fall, it'll eventually incorporate too. So that is one way to kill it on a regenerative farming kind of level. But what if you're in, on a human scale kind of level, but what if you're in on a bigger field? Any ways to kill a cover crop?
A big fire.
A big fire. Yep, you could do that. Watch out, it could be dangerous. Winter killing is another one too. Depends on the cover crop that you have chosen. But if you have a cover crop that can overwinter, such as your rye, such as your clover, such as your alfalfa, the answer here is a tool called a crimper. And I meant to put a crimper up on my slideshow, but I forgot. So you might have to Google that one. But there is something out there. There's a tool called a crop crimper, and it bends your crop in such a way that it kills it. And it's really strange, this little machine. You don't think it's going to kill your crop, but you run this over top of a ryegrass field, and it crimps it all and kills it. I met a guy last fall who has a crop crimper for his BCS, and I was like, ding! And I really want to borrow this and see if it works out well. I never knew it existed, but there is a tool out there called a crop crimper, and you run this over top of a thick field of clover or ryegrass or oatgrass or whatever it happens to be, and it crimps the stalk in such a way that it kills the plant. And I haven't played around with it very much, but I really like to try to do more cover cropping on Hayes Farm and then get into that crop crimper in order to kill them. And what's often done, even on a conventional agricultural level, when people practice no-till, they will grow a crop of, you name it, maybe ryegrass, which will overwinter and come back in spring. Then they run their crop crimper over this, and this is like on a conventional level. So instead of spraying that crop with glyphosate, they're instead running a crop crimper over top of that crop, and that kills that crop down. And then they have a piece of equipment called a seed drill, and that will drop a seed in between those rows of your killed cover crop. And so that field never has to be tilled. And there's a lot of conventional farmers that are moving to this no-till. It is becoming very, very popular in conventional farming because it produces so much organic matter in your field, conserves so much moisture, reduces so much runoff. No-till is a great practice for organic or conventional farming. And it's all done with that crop crimper. Okay, so we also talked about top dressing foliar sprays, compost teas, and rocks and mineral dust. These are all applicable to regenerative farming as well. More additions beyond those are biodynamic preparations. And we've talked about the cow horn example where you pack cow manure into a cow horn that has been shedded, and that horn needs to come from a cow and not a bull. Then that horn needs to be buried and then unearthed and then put into a barrel, a wooden barrel. It's got to be a wooden barrel, and then stirred in a proper way, and that's spread all over your farm. And that is one biodynamic preparation that is used to encourage microbes on your farm, microbe growth. But that is only one of 9 different preparations. Linked with all sorts of different preparations out there involving all sorts of different plants, and they're very common plants like dandelion and nettle and comfrey and yarrow, and there's all sorts of different biodynamic preparations that can be made. If you're interested in those, there's a link there. Effective microorganisms is a regenerative farming technique as well, and that's great for introducing, that's something that has to be purchased in, that is created in a laboratory, but it introduces over 80 different bacterial microbes to either your compost or your soil. Ramial chipped wood is something that you can do yourself. That is taking those small branches of wood, less than, I believe it is 3 inches in diameter, and chopping those up and incorporating those into your soil, which are great for fungal activity. That gives your soil a nice fungal boost, which woody plants love. And so in the woody plants, you're talking about any shrubs or trees and that kind of stuff, they love that high fungal activity. Leaf mold is also great for increasing fungal activity, and these are all good regenerative farming techniques. And then in that working with soil lecture, it was also mentioned as another fertility management technique is the proper stimulation of biological practices that are already underway on your farm. And so here we're talking about proper management of water resources. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. You're talking about proper management of the air in your soil through proper tilling or not, and proper aerating or not, and proper mulching. And then the management of your micro and macro organisms, that whole healthy soil food web. Your goal here is to not take away a functional job of a member of your ecosystem. A lot of gardeners want to have that nice, clean, tidy garden. And if you go in there and you clean up everything in your garden, you're making very livable very little material available for your decomposers. If there are no food for your decomposers, then of course your decomposer population is going to go down. And then as a result of that, there's going to be less nutrients made available to your plants through that decomposition process. Therefore, that farmer, after you clean up your garden really nice, because you want a nice neat garden, you must then take on the responsibility of feeding your plants. But if you left that mulch, that organic material, that debris in your garden, that will encourage those decomposition role in that ecosystem, and then that will help feed your plants. By taking away a functional job of your ecosystem, you're creating more jobs for yourself as a farmer. It is nice to be able to have a diversity of fertilization practices through a regenerative farming lens. You want to achieve good biodiversity in your ecosystem. And you also want to achieve good biodiversity in your fertility management approach as well. Some fertilizers and some fertility management approaches will boost your bacteria content of your soil and your micro contents of your soil, such as effective microorganisms and building nice healthy composts. And some other fertilizers will boost fungal activity in your soil, such as leaf mold or your ramial wood chips. Some fertilizers can feed the plants directly, such as foliar sprays and specific applications of minerals to plants. And some will feed the soil through mulching and applications of things like green sand or biodynamic preparations or cover cropping. And some fertilizers, like your manures, will introduce microbes and bacteria from animal intestines, which you couldn't find in plants to start with in the first place. So it's adding just even small bits of manure to your compost will introduce all sorts of new bacteria and microbes into your compost pile. What is best for you in your ecosystem is a matter of you to decide, and it's probably a little bit of each of the above, and it's nice to be able to have a nice diversity in your fertility management approach. Next I wanted to talk about fertility management practices that I had implemented on grassroots organics, and then compare them to what I have going on at Crocs Point Road. Just to give you a contrast between that farm level and then that home backyard kind of level. So at Grassroots Organics, we were rotating our entire garden. So picture a 10-acre, fairly square 10-acre field, and then just divide that, put a cross right across it, and divide that into 4 sections. And at one point in our gardening practices, we were rotating our entire garden from one section to the next, to the next, to the next, and then back around, and that we were on a 4-year rotation plan. And in the meantime, after rotating our garden, we would establish a cover crop, like an entire field of clover or an entire field of alfalfa, in order to fix nitrogen and keep weeds out. And then we would rotate our entire garden, not just like crop rotation within the garden, but rotating that entire garden around a 10-acre field. And so that would give us a minimum of 3 or 4 years between crops. But within those crops, we are also rotating those crops. So in practice, we are probably getting a much larger rotation than that. At first, when we first started doing that, we had that 4-year block kind of approach, but then we switched it to a 3-year approach where we were gardening more of that 10-acre field. So we're gardening about 3 acres of it at a time, and then cover cropping the other, 6.66 acres. At Grassroots Organics, we were also buying in certified organic compost, which was a leaf mulch-based compost, which was a fungal-rich compost. We are also playing around with foliar sprays. We played around a bit with the aerated compost tea. We bought in some fish emulsion, and we bought in some liquefied kelp, and we were spraying that with foliar sprayers. And then we also had our own manure. We were raising poultry, we raised chickens, we raised turkeys, we raised ducks sometimes. We raised pigs for a few years, and then we would spread that onto our gardens every fall. So that's grassroots organics, kind of farmy kind of scale fertility management. Crocs Point Road, where I'm at currently, composting is very important for my fertility management practice for my backyard kind of garden. We have some very small scale housing of some animals at my household here. We got 1 guinea pig, also known as a cavy. We got 24 quails and 6 chickens. And as I was mentioning, that might not be a whole lot of animals in order to fertilize whole big garden areas, but on a small backyard level, all you're really looking to do is boost that microbe population in your compost, and all the waste from all these animals end up in my compost and get well composted before putting it onto my gardens. And I think it goes a long way to diversifying my microbes in my compost, and therefore my microbes in my garden. Into that compost go all the waste products from the gardens and kitchen scraps as well, and everything gets well composted before use. On a small backyard kind of level, we also have a vermicompost bin, much like the one we have here at the farm, just a Rubbermaid bin. The most use we get out of that is by running water through that occasionally. And then you collect all the water, all the leachate out of the bottom, and then you can dilute that 20 times over and then use that as a fertilizer in your garden, and that goes a long way. I like to cover crop with beans at my home garden. Beans is one of those things that get extremely killed over winter and incorporate well into your soil. So after I harvest out a vegetable out of the garden, say it's like something like garlic, where it gets harvested out, July, August, and then there's still a month and a half that you can grow beans in. So I'll plant those beans, and not for any intention of ever yielding the bean out of it, but just to grow that bean plant. Bean plant is a nitrogen fixer, so it'll fix nitrogen as it grows, produce these nice broad leaves that then get incorporated as organic matter into the soil. Just like at Hayes Farm, I also like a nice heavy mulch application in the fall. I buy in spoiled straw from my neighbor across the street and apply that nice and heavily. We have a good 5-year crop rotation plan in effect at Crocs Point Road as well. And then I also like to run the chickens into the garden in the late fall and again in the early spring to do a little bit of direct fertilization, and then also to pick out any insects and slugs and that kind of stuff. And I also practice no-till, just like we do here at Hayes Farm, encouraging all my different soil life to stay in place and not get chopped up with any kind of rototillering. And something else I've been playing with is the concept of encouraging deer to fertilize my garden in the late fall and into the winter. And I do that simply by taking down my electric fence and leaving all my crop residues in place. And then the deer will come by and eat and nibble on just anything that's green in the garden. At first, I thought it was the cabbage family that they were after, the broccoli leaves after I'm done harvesting up the broccoli in the fall, and leftover kale leaves. But they were also eating like things that were like leftover like onion out there too. And I was very surprised. Like almost anything that's green, the deer will come and eat, and then leave me a deposit of fertilizer while they're in there. And I got a lot of deer pellets around. Okay, so I brought up grassroots organics and grassroots organics and Crocs Point Road just as kind of 4 examples. I want to start talking about Hayes Farm next. I don't have a ton of time, so I talk too much, but I would love to talk more about fertility management at Hayes Farm and trying to achieve a closed loop system here at Hayes Farm. My grassroots organic example, I was still buying in compost, so that wasn't exactly a closed loop system. At Crocs Point Road, it being a smaller operation and just kind of my backyard kind of thing, I'm able to get a closed loop operation and I'm not buying in anything fertility management wise at Crocs Point Road, which I'm really happy about. And I'd love to be able to get there with Hayes Farm. And if you guys have any ideas, I'd love to be able to talk about that right now. So first, we're going to identify all the different fertility management practices currently underway at Hayes Farm, which is in the hoop house. We got a bit of hugelkultur kind of style. In all of our planters, we sunk big hunks of wood down first. Then the ones on the north end in particular got a little bit more wood chips on top of that. They got more brewer's grains on top of that, and then topsoil and compost went in on top of that. So we got a bit of a hugelkultur kind of system in our greenhouse planters, and that's going to help us out with some fertility management there. And then compost, of course, we use a lot of that at Hayes Farm. We try to make our own, but we can't possibly keep up to the scale of the farm with our composting that we make. So we also purchase in. The compost that we're currently using is coming from a place in Sussex. They're the closest certified organic compost makers we could find in Cardwell, is the name of the operation. We also use a little bit of manure here at Hayes Farm, mostly in the form of bedding from the Frex. When Frex closes up from the exhibition there, we get them to dump bedding in at the farm here. The bedding is mostly straw and or wood chips, but there is a light bit of manure that's mixed in there. It's not as if it's coming from a barn where horses and cows have been doing their stuff for months. It's just coming from the Frex where they've just been doing it for a week or two. And so we only got a little bit of manure that comes in, but that's all right. I like to be able to apply a little bit of that in the fall too. We like to do a heavy mulch application of straw coming from the Duplessis, which is my neighbors there right across the street from me at Cross Point Road. We also, of course, practice crop rotation here at Hayes Farm. In 2018, we were playing around with foliar sprays. As I was saying during the working with soil lecture, sometimes it's necessary on a newly formed garden to give your plants boosts. So through foliar sprays, and that's what we were doing in 2018, but I'm trying to stay more away from those as we move forward. In theory, our ecosystem should be working for us, and we shouldn't need to be able to do those individual boosts as much, in theory. It's kind of worked out in practice too, I'll admit. So foliar sprays is something we're trying to get away from. We do the no-till in order to, as we were saying, establish that fungal mycorrhizae layer and encourage more micro and macroorganisms to establish themselves. And we do play around with a little bit of cover cropping in the fall in the form of peas on top of our beds, because peas will take a frost and they can be planted anytime in September and even into October and form a nice little stubble of peas across the top. The roots go down and fix nitrogen and hold the soil in place. So we do a little bit of cover cropping with peas, but not very much cover cropping at this point. So as I was saying, we haven't achieved a closed loop system here at Hayes Farm yet. We are still buying in our fertility, mostly in the form of compost, and the mulch as well. And I don't love that. I would love to be able to move towards a closed loop system. And I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts about that and what a closed loop system could look like here at Hayes Farm. In a previous lecture, I forget what that topic was, maybe it was the composting one, I introduced that worm bin, that verma bin that I would love to be able to establish here at Hayes Farm, a big pass-through worm bin that we'd be able to make all of our own compost from. However, that comes with a large price tag. That machine, by the time all is said and done, would probably cost us about $3,000 or so. So it's a matter of trying to track down some grants for that kind of thing. Of course, there is animals that can be used for fertility management, except I've always had a bit of pushback here at Hayes Farm. We are not zoned for having animals, and every time I brought up different animals, I've always been shut down so far, but I would love to be able to have different animals here at the farm. Where I would start is probably quail or rabbits. Something that it can be kept relatively tight in an area with a small pen to run around in. Maybe move on to chickens. I love the idea of having some goats around to keep down some vegetation, and you can tether goats to different things and move them around the farm. But as I was saying, we've been shut down in the animal department so far. Something else I'm interested in looking into, but I've never really played around with much yet, is biochar. And that is kind of like making charcoal. You're purposely burning materials, it could be various materials, in a low oxygen environment, and then you're using that carbon rich material afterwards as fertilizer, and biochar is certainly interesting, and I want to look at more into that. Ramial wood chips is something else I've mentioned. But I'm also curious in knowing if you guys have any suggestions for more fertility management options at Hayes Farm. What about compost tea, aerated compost tea making? Guys got anything else here to add to my list? Things to look into? These are all things I talk about at the field operation working groups when we get into fertility management discussions, and anything more I can bring, I would appreciate. And I'm totally into any kind of ideas that you guys have. And even if you guys don't have any ideas immediately, because I understand how it is to be put on the spot, if you guys have any ideas about fertility management into the future as you're working out here on the fields, doing some weeding and this and that, and giving it some thought, please let me know. I want to keep adding my list here, keep increasing my list. And like I said, I want to move towards a closed loop system where we don't have to buy in our fertility here at Hayes Farm, which I find tricky without animals. That's traditionally how I've always kind of approached my fertility management. It's always started with animals. Cover cropping is neat too, except we don't have equipment for cover cropping, but maybe we should add that to our list. All right, if you guys don't have anything more to add to this list, that's going to conclude our lecture today.